I'm joined today by Dr. Stephan Guyenet, an obesity researcher and health writer whose work spans multiple fields of science to explain and help tackle the global weight problem. He's the author of the popular health website Whole Health Source at wholehealthsource.org, frequently lectures on the topics of obesity, metabolism, and diet history. It's so great to have you on. There's really so much here to address, and I think maybe a good place to start is talk to us a little bit about, first of all, I guess, the history of weight as a problem in human society. My guess would be that when humans were in the pre-agriculture phase, in the hunter-gatherer era, that issues of obesity were not nearly as problematic as they were now. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, it's hard to know exactly what was going on with our pre-agricultural ancestors thousands of years ago because most of what we have are just bones. However, what we can do is we can look at current day hunter-gatherers, and what we know from current day hunter-gatherers is that obesity is very, very rare. In fact, I'm not aware of a single case of actual obesity among an actual hunter-gatherer population. There are some cases you can find of people who would be classified as a bit overweight, but that's about as far as it goes. So I think obesity really is a very new problem in human history. That's not to say it never existed. Actually, you can find obesity going back a long time in agricultural societies that were affluent, such as in ancient Egypt. We know that certain Egyptian mummies had obesity, or the people who are now mummies had obesity in life. Um, and so this is something that goes back a long time in affluent contexts. But I think in terms of I think even in that context, it was relatively restricted to affluent people.
And was there
So
there was a certain point where, I mean, I think the timing of it would be sort of as humans were starting to get out of a sort of persistent state of scarcity, where sort of carrying extra weight was almost seen as a symbol of status and wealth. And I think that that connects to what you're saying about affluence as well. I mean, in the Roman Empire, the idea of having an abundance of food and gaining weight was almost seen as a status symbol, was it not?
yeah, that's right, and that was true in a lot of cultures. You see that even up until relatively recently in Polynesian cultures, for example. The In some instances, the chief of the village or the island was deliberately overfed and often became quite obese in order to demonstrate the affluence and power of that group of people as a symbol, basically. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It was um, considered to be a marker of affluence and something to be desired. And I think we actually see that still a lot, even in older elements of our own culture. I mean, I think at least some people will have memories of a grandparent telling them to eat more and putting more food on their plate. I think that even just a century ago in the United States, that was more the culture than it is today.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a Jewish household, so I could tell you it's much more recent than just 100 years ago that that type of thing goes on. So the concept of a diet, right? How far back do we have a sense of how far back that concept exists in human culture?
Yeah, I'm not really an expert on the history of dieting. However, I mean, I definitely have come across traces of it going as far back as the ancient Greeks. I mean, I think uh, Hippocrates used to talk about balancing food intake and exercise, and essentially that the two had to be in balance for a person to uh, remain lean and in good health. And if they were out of balance, if you were eating too much food and getting not enough exercise, that you would accumulate fat, and that had severe health consequences. So I think that kind of concept has existed for a long time. But I think I think as a society, probably we haven't been as obsessed about it as we are currently ever in human history because obesity just hasn't been as much of a problem.
So how can we measure? I'd like to jump into that next. How could we maybe quantify the extent to which obesity and weight are a problem today in society? What are some ways that someone like you approaches measuring the issue?
Yeah, so there are a variety of different data sets that we can look at. The best data that we have goes back to about 1960, and it uses a measure called the body mass index. And this is basically just a measure of weight that's been corrected for height. And it's a great measure in a sense because it's very easy to get. All you need is a person's height and a person's weight. And so we have data, pretty systematic data from the United States going back to about 1960, showing that our body mass index and our body fatness, therefore, has increased quite a bit over that half century period. And there's a particularly sharp increase that started somewhere between the late 70s and the early 80s. But we can actually see traces of it starting even much earlier than that. So there are data from Civil War veterans from the late 1800s showing that only 1 in 17 middle-aged white men was obese at that time, whereas today the number is 40-something%, I think. So there have been very dramatic changes that began a very long time ago, more than a century ago in this country.
Now, Stephan, to play devil's advocate as far as BMI, I've done quite a bit of reading on that issue. And from what I've read, it may not be the best way to assess obesity only because it doesn't take into account sort of body composition, that someone who is heavy because of overeating would be showing up similarly to someone who has more muscle mass, for example. How do you feel about some of the weaknesses of BMI on that basis?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely limitations to it as a measure. So one example I like to use is that Arnold Schwarzenegger at his peak, at his bodybuilding peak, had a BMI of, I believe it was 30.1, which puts him just over the cusp of the obese range. And, you know, he had a body fat percentage of probably something in the 5 to 6% range. So yeah, it has its limitations, but the reality is that most of us are not Arnold Schwarzenegger. And if you look at, so the most accurate way of measuring body fatness is to measure it directly using things like underwater weighing or dual X-ray densitometry, absorptiometry. And those are things that directly measure the amount of fat in your body. So they give you an actual body fat percentage or kilos of body fat. And if you do those and you compare them, if you do the gold standard measures and you compare them to BMI, what you find is that about something like 1 in 5 people is miscategorized by BMI, either because they have a lot of muscle mass or because they have not very much muscle mass. So it definitely happens, but it's not something that happens in most people. And it's also, when you're looking at population averages, such as those I was talking about in the United States, it's actually a very good measure because some people are going to be miscategorized in either direction, but on average, it's actually a really good measure. And so I don't think anyone is arguing, for example, that the increase in BMI since 1970 in the United States is because we all put on a bunch of muscle mass. So yeah, it has its weaknesses, but particularly as a measure of groups of individuals, and particularly as a measure of groups of individuals of European or African descent, it tends to be a pretty good measure.
Okay, so causes of obesity and weight issues in modern society. Things that are thrown around: sedentary lifestyle, right? Amount of not doing anything versus doing something. When it comes to diet, whether it's diet in the form of total calorie consumption versus diet in the form of the specific foods that are being consumed, environmental factors, other societal factors, etc. How can we start putting together a picture of what the causes are of the situation we're in today?
Yeah, the way I like to do it to try to get a toehold on what's going on is to start to think about calorie intake and calorie expenditure, which is what you're alluding to here. So what, you know, basically our body fatness is determined by the number of calories coming in versus the number leaving. And so by trying to figure out which side of that equation calories coming in or calories leaving, is the one that we should be focusing on. That helps us kind of deconstruct the situation. And what we see if we look at calorie expenditure in the United States, it's gone down quite a bit over the last century. I mean, we used to have very, very physical jobs. A lot of the things that we did in our daily lives, like washing laundry and making food and taking care of the house and things like that, not having automobiles, used to be a lot more physical. So our physical activity has definitely declined quite a bit. However, that doesn't really account for the obesity epidemic itself, which is this rapid rise in obesity prevalence that began around the late 70s or early 80s. And what we see if we look at that period of history is that our physical activity didn't really change that much. It may have changed somewhat, but not that much. What really changed is our calorie intake increased by quite a bit. And what happened was there was this decoupling that occurred between our food intake, our calorie intake, and our calorie needs. So the human brain and body has, to some limited extent, the ability to balance those two things and control body weight. But around that time, there was this decoupling that happened where our calorie intake just kind of went through the roof, and our physical activity did not increase proportionally.
Let's pick it up there with Dr. Stephan Guyenet, obesity researcher, health writer, his website, wholehealthsource.org. We will pick it up right there with him tomorrow. We're continuing today with Dr. Stephan Guyenet, an obesity researcher and health writer whose work spans multiple fields of science to help explain and tackle the global weight problem. You can check out his website, wholehealthsource.org. We stopped yesterday talking about sort of the general causes of the obesity and weight problem in the United States, and we also observe it in other societies. Do you have a sense of, I've read this, what purports to be a rule of thumb, that when you're talking about weight loss, that it's overwhelmingly, some say 75, 80, 85, 90% calories in, and only 10, 15, 20% exercise or calorie expenditure. Do you have a thought on that ratio?
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to put a number on it. I think physical activity is important. However, the key thing to remember is that you can always out-eat your physical activity. So no matter how much, almost regardless of how much you're exercising, you can always out-eat it. So the question is, how much are you eating relative to how much you're expending? And I think that's really the critical thing. And for me, that does put the focus more on food intake in terms of determining body fatness.
I'd like to dig in a little bit to diet more specifically, and then maybe we can talk about specific issues like fat, carbs, sugar, salt, etc. When you sort of look at the average Western diet, what's your assessment of it? I mean, that the food pyramid that's in your mind as the ideal pyramid, and maybe it's not a pyramid shape at all, which I think might be kind of interesting. What does that look like?
Yeah, so first of all, the average Western diet, or at least the average American diet, is truly atrocious. So in 2010, and honestly, it really even shocks me to see this data as much as I've read about what we're eating. In 2010, the USDA Dietary Advisory Committee released a report showing what the top sources of calories are in the US diet. And the number one source of calories in the US diet, I kid you not, is a category called grain-based desserts. And this is cake, cookies, donuts, pastries, that sort of thing. That is the number one source of calories in the US diet. And in the top six are bread, chicken, pizza, soda, and alcohol. That's the top six right there. So, I mean, the US diet on average is really, really, really bad. And I think there are a lot of things that are wrong with it. And if I were to propose a healthier diet, it would be one that's based primarily on whole, unrefined foods that have a lower calorie density, that is fewer calories per volume. So, for example, crackers have a very high calorie density because there's no water in them, as opposed to oatmeal, which has a lower calorie density. So foods that have a lower calorie density, that are simple, natural, unrefined foods, things that are more similar to what our ancestors would have eaten, and drive our things that don't seduce us to overeat them, like what is it, Pringles that say bet you can't eat just one. I mean, these are foods that are literally designed to motivate us to purchase them and eat them. And those are the types of food that drive us to eat too much. So if we can have a diverse, unrefined, omnivorous diet, I think that we would be much better off than we are currently.
Over time, we've seen the focus of the food industry, the diet industry, et cetera, often trend towards a particular aspect of nutrition. And there was a period some decades ago where the focus was fat. You should cut out fat and replace it with other stuff. And a lot of times what it was being replaced with was, as you're talking about, calorie dense but relatively unnutritious foods. The low carb diets of the sort of Atkins diet fame, although there's no shortage of other ones that focus on not eating carbohydrates. The focus on sugar as a sort of component to be avoided. What's your sense of this? Are there any of these that make particular sense to you, or any that acutely don't make sense?
I mean, I think they all make some degree of sense. I think that none of them would be as popular as they are, or at least were, without some grain of truth. However, I think all of them are one component of the bigger picture, which is that all of those things, fat and sugar and carbohydrate, are things that contribute to overeating and fat gain, and cutting them out helps people slim down. And that's not to say that all diets are equally effective. It is true that low carbohydrate diets tend to help people lose weight more effectively than at least your standard moderate low fat diet. So, however, I mean, those diets all will help you lose weight. But I think what is kind of disturbing to me is to see people focus exclusively on one factor and then ignore everything else. And I think the sugar mania that has gripped this country over the last, I don't know, few months or maybe even years is an example of that. I think that, I mean, I don't think sugar is good for you. I don't eat any refined sugar, or very, very, very little. I eat plenty of fruit. I eat lots of fruit. Um, I eat very little refined sugar. I don't think it's good for you, or at least not for most people. But I also don't think that it's the cause of all of our ills, and I don't even think it's the main cause of all of our ills. I mean, if I could choose between a lifestyle where my calories were in check and I was physically active, but I was eating a fair amount of sugar, and a lifestyle where I was not active and eating too many calories and eating no sugar, I would definitely choose the first one over the second one. I mean, there's a priority list for health, and sugar is on there somewhere, but it's not number one.
As far as some of the different buzzwords that are thrown around, then sugar-free is one of them, and we've spoken extensively with experts about how that, as a marketing tool, can actually be incredibly deceptive. Loaded with antioxidants, potentially has anti-inflammatory properties, etc. Number one, how accurately can we assess some of those claims? And number two, is that even really what one should be paying attention to in terms of the composition of their diet?
No, I don't think so. And first of all, I think the majority of those claims, frankly, are just baloney. Um, those foods that make claims like that are generally not going to deliver you any benefit whatsoever, and particularly when compared to whole, unrefined foods. Um, and the fact is that a lot of those foods that make claims like that are the very foods that are the most refined, that are probably contributing to the problem more than anything. So,
What
I
would be an
mean,
example of that?
Sunny Delight with vitamin C in it.
Mm.
I mean, these are Tang with vitamin C. Putting vitamin C in there is a cheap trick, basically, to try to get people to think it's healthy. And instead, it's just sugar water. It's colored sugar water. So, and there are many, many foods like this. So I think that it's very easy to be tricked by this. I mean, even I am sometimes. Like, I don't eat bread very often, but I bought a loaf of bread the other day, and I saw the bread. It looked dark. It said multi-grain on it. And it wasn't until I brought it home that I realized it wasn't actually whole grain. It was multi-grain, which means it has different types of refined grains in it, but it wasn't a whole grain food. So I had even myself, who I'm tend to be extremely aware of this sort of thing, even I am able to be tricked sometimes. So I think you really have to stick with simple heuristics like choosing the most unrefined foods that you can possibly choose and not choose, not even look at those processed foods and decide between them on the basis of whatever, health or nutrient claims they have on the package.
Is bread a good example of where you can make more informed decisions in the sense that at my local grocery store, for example, you have one area of breads, which are kind of like the more local bakeries. And when you look at the ingredient list, it's like 4 to 6 ingredients. And I sort of recognize everything that's on that list. I can also go down to the packaged bread aisle. Those breads have anywhere from 15 to 25 ingredients, many of which I don't recognize. Are there significant differences in terms of the health impact of choosing a 4 ingredient bread, and you can sort of imagine what those ingredients are, versus one of the factory breads?
I don't know. Maybe. I tend to think probably how refined the flour is a larger factor. So,
Interesting.
I hate to be the pessimist, but that local bread that's made with white flour is probably not so good for you. I mean, white flour is inherently not a food that is supportive of health. So, yeah, I mean, I personally, just based on the precautionary principle, I would probably tend to favor something that's simpler like the local bread, and certainly it would taste better. But do those extra ingredients make any difference for health? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure.
Last thing I want to touch on, we have a lot of vegetarians, pescatarians. We've got a vegan working on the show. There's a lot of these different preference choices that people are making with regard to animal product consumption. Not from a moral or ethical standpoint or one of animal cruelty, et cetera, but from a health impact. Where do you fall on what share of one's diet it makes sense to have animal products be? And feel free to distinguish between sort of dairy and meat if that's relevant.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely compelling reasons to be vegetarian and vegan, and I have a lot of respect for people who choose that lifestyle. However, humans have been eating animal foods for, probably at least 100 million years, maybe more than that. Our ancestors is what I mean. We evolved from insectivores originally, mammalian insectivores, and then after that we became primates about 60 million years ago, and our animal food intake probably went down quite a bit, but almost all primates eat insects, so we probably were never completely vegetarian or vegan, with some exceptions like gorillas. Um, but chimpanzees are closest living relatives. They eat a little bit of meat, they eat insects regularly. And if you look at human evolution, it's really, since the evolution of our genus, Homo, 2.6 million years ago, it's really a progression toward higher calorie density of the foods. And part of that was eating more animal foods.
Hmm.
So our ancestors have been eating, I don't want to say high levels necessarily, but variable levels, some of which were high, for millions of years. And the human body really is, I mean, humans truly are obligate omnivores. We cannot survive literally without some amount of animal foods because we have an absolute dietary requirement for vitamin B12, which is only found in animal foods. So there's no doubt that our physiology requires animal foods. Today we can supplement with B12, and I think we can do fine, at least some people, but I think that it's more than just about the B12. I think that human physiology has been receiving animal foods for so long that we are adapted to those things. And I think there's much less of a difference between being an omnivore and being a vegetarian in terms of nutrition and physiology than there is between being a vegetarian and a vegan.
Mm.
Because there, when you're eating a vegan diet, you're not eating any animal foods, and so there's a whole like swath of nutrients that you're either not getting or you're gonna have a harder time getting. Some of those are essential nutrients like B12. Some of them are non-essential nutrients like creatine, something that enhances physical performance. Um, and and there are probably other things that we don't even know about yet that the human body is just accustomed to because it's been receiving those things for millions and millions of years. So, and then that brings us to the question of how much we should be eating. And I don't really have a definitive answer for that, but I would say that the if we go looking for the healthiest cultures we can find, that are not hunter-gatherers, people who are living a little bit more like we're living in the modern world today, you tend to find the healthiest people do not generally eat a lot of meat. So they're omnivores. I mean, every culture in the world is omnivorous unless they have some kind of religious restriction on meat. Every culture in the world eats meat, um, and some sort of animal food. But I think that the quantities that you see in the cultures that have longer lifespans and better chronic disease rates tend to be lower. And so, myself personally, not as much for health reasons, more for environmental reasons, I tend to eat less meat than most people, but I do eat some meat.
Absolutely fascinating. Very, very informative. We've been speaking with Dr. Stephan Guyenet, who's an obesity researcher and health writer. I encourage you to check out his website, wholehealthsource.org. So great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, David.